Okay, I'd like to bring this meeting to order. The Village Board of Trustees of Villa Park Committee of the Whole meeting, October 14th, 2024. Clerk Konecki, please call the roll.
It's Trustee Alfano.
Here.
Trustee Cordova.
Here.
Trustee Corkery. Trustee Kozar. Trustee Kumar. Trustee Patrick.
Here.
President Kazone.
Here. And if we could please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, item 3 tonight is discussion of the TIF alternative revenue source GO bond sale in support of the Union Apartment Project. The TIF is a tax increment financing district, and GO are general obligation bonds. And I'll turn it over to Manager Harline.
Jeff Dickinson is here, and I'll call him up in just a second from SB Freeman. He's going to discuss the financial analysis and projections for the proposed Union at Old Town project proposed by Marquette Companies and Three Leaf Partners. In order for Spear Financial, and Anthony Maselli is here from Spear Financial, to develop a projection for the bond coverage and repayment schedule, SB Freeman had to look at the developer's project for the numbers of proposed units, types of units, estimated property value, and construction, likely increases in the property value over time. They also needed to project the escalation of the required tuition payments per student for school districts to satisfy the requirements that the village cover those payments for all students who move into the district and live in the project in a TIF district. Without a intergovernmental agreement, the TIF must pay up to 13% of the increment to the secondary school and 27% to the elementary school in the TIF district. Therefore, SB Freeman must make an estimate of the probable number of children that are expected to move into the TIF district to make their analysis. Anthony Maselli from Spear is also here to discuss their analysis. They took those projections and the increment generated and payments required from Mr. Dickinson and Emma Bonanno Lynch, who is not here tonight, but did a lot of the work at SB Freeman, and determined there is still sufficient projected revenue to cover the payments and have the 25% additional coverage required for a non-home rule municipality selling GO bonds. So that's kind of what both of these parties did. They are our advisors. The analysis done at the previous meeting when we looked at it was a lot of it was done by other very qualified experts that are working for Marquette and Three Leaf Partners, but this is the required analysis by the village's experts. And without any further ado, I was going to let Jeff Dickinson from SB Freeman make his presentation.
Hi. Should I go over to this one, I guess? Is that the way to do it? Okay.
Yeah, that's
Good evening. Nice to see you all. Nice to meet some of you. My name is Jeff Dickinson, as Matt said. I'm with a firm called SB Friedman Development Advisors. We are a consulting firm based in Chicago. We are economic development consultants. We work for mostly cities and governments. Sometimes we work for developers. Obviously, as Matt said, we're working for you and the village at this point, giving you our objective advice and information for your consideration. Again, Matt sort of laid out our job. Our job is to prepare independent property tax projections. What are the projected taxes going to be from this project, and then how much of that money will be available to pay should you approve bonds to support the project. A very high-level summary. I know you've seen a lot from Marquette about the project, but from our point of view, the most germane facts are there are 234 residential units. The mix of units is relevant, particularly when I talk a little bit about the school kids considerations. There are 2 and 3 bedroom units where you might see more school kids certainly than a studio or 1 bedroom. There is some retail in the project, and there is a financing gap Marquette has indicated of $13 million. So that's sort of the solve for number at this point. This is still preliminary work, but we wanted to make sure that our numbers in concert with Spears think this is a problem that can be solved, essentially. And then, obviously, there's a lot of details in terms of agreements and so forth, and contracts and negotiation to go, but we want to make sure the math roughly work before we go too far down that road and get some direction from you. So we'll jump right to the answer to start, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the issues that we worked through in our analysis. Over the life of the TIF district, so over the 23 years, we project about $43 million of incremental taxes in total. And then the subtraction is the school and library payments. State law, and I'll go into it in a little more detail as to how we got to these answers, requires that payments be made to school districts, grade school and high school, and the library district based on the increment from TIF-supported housing. So if you use TIF fund, if the apartment would just get built inside of a TIF, but there was no agreement to support it, those payments would not be made or required to be made, or allowed actually, to the schools. But because the village is considering making financial support available to the project, you're subject to these requirements. You have to make payments, and these monies come off the top. So the money lands in the TIF fund, the special tax allocation fund that the village controls, and before any payments can go anywhere else, they have to go to the schools and the library. So they're essentially money off the top every year. And in aggregate, over the life of the TIF, that's about $10 million, we project, of payments that are going to have to be made off the top to the schools and the library district. But that $33 million number is the number that we project is available to make debt service payments on the bonds. And so I'll talk through as I say, that's the answer, and there's a table at the end of this presentation that shows when that money shows up. Timing is important to the calculations that Spear and Anthony have to do. But that's the aggregate answer, is give or take $33 million available to pay on the bonds. Matt alluded to the escalation assumption. So, we're doing projections today about a project that has not yet started construction. So once that project is delivered, we have to make an assumption about how much their taxes are going to go up every year, basically. We usually start with something like 1.5% or 2%. That's our sort of default assumption, sort of tied to consumer price index, more or less, and assume that taxes are going to grow as fast as inflation. Again, we don't know what inflation will be in 15 years. Nobody knows that. But we do have to make a 23-year projection. And so this is a number that is material. We did look at growth in taxes in the village. We call it clean growth. We excluded annexations and new construction. I think those of you who've been on the board for a long time, or maybe all of you, understand how that works in the calculation of rate. So we did some analysis, deeper analysis of growth in the last couple of years, and it's been a little over 2%, 2.3%. So we've assumed that's going to be the answer every year for the rest of the life of the TIF. That's not going to be the answer every year for the rest of the life of the TIF. The answer one year will be, hopefully there'll be 2.4, 2.2, 2.4, 2.2 if we're geniuses. But we think it's a reasonable assumption. If it goes higher, then the taxes will be higher, and that would be good from the village point of view. If it goes lower, then the taxes would be lower. And there's coverage in the model and in the requirements under law. But we think a 2.3% annual assumption is a safe one based on the last couple of years of growth in the village. The other really big variable is the value of each apartment unit. We looked at comparable properties in York Township, and we spoke to the York Township assessor. So we've assumed they're worth almost $80,000 a unit. That's consistent with comparables. It's not the highest number of new product, but it's up there, but that's defensible. That's what the comps are. There's 3 or 4 comps all kind of clustering in the high 70s. So we use 79. If we made it 78, just to be straight with you how this works, we easily say 78 with the information that we've used, but we feel comfortable with 79. We're going to own that decision. We could also say 80. You know what I mean? These are not precise numbers, but they're reasonable inputs to a model. We assume construction starts in the spring. I know Marquette's trying to get going sooner, so I don't think that's going to materially change the answer. That's a couple of months one way or another. It doesn't really change the projections, but sooner's better. So obviously I think if we want them to do that, you want them to do that. Everybody wants them to go as fast as they can. If it pushes out a long way, then that would be adverse. If they can't get in the ground until next December, that would not be good, but the bonds won't be sold, I don't think, until we're very close to knowing when that's going to happen. So we're not there yet, but it's easy to adjust the model as that date becomes more certain in terms of when they're going to be in the ground. And the TIF was adopted, as you well know. You were the people who adopted it this year. So this gets a little bit, I'll try to make this clear. The column on the right is the statutory maximum. So state law says, as I mentioned, the money comes off the top every year for tuition payments and library payments. It can be as much as 40% of the increment going to the schools and 2% going to the library. But the payments you will be required to make off the top are going to be a function not of the maximum, but of actual people. So real human beings who live in these apartment units. So the schools will have to ask for payments, and they'll have to provide some evidence that there are school-aged children living in the buildings. That'll be submitted to you. You will review it. Someone will deem it reasonable or the documentation acceptable, and then the payments will be made. So if no kids show up, no payments are required, I guess, in the positive. And if 1 million kids show up, which we don't believe is likely, you would hit the maximums, if that makes sense, by state law. So you could have as much as 40% taken off the top, and the 2% is on a per capita basis. So it's per, I think, person who's eligible for a library card, which is pretty fussy stuff. I don't know if there's an age minimum for library cards in your library district, but we've assumed 2% for that one because it's a small number. It doesn't really change the answer. So that's the max. That's the worst case. So if for some reason these apartment units have lots more people living in them than our projections, which is the column on the left, you could have to take that amount of money off the top. We looked at information from other villages that we work with on apartments like this, new construction, higher priced, suburban downtown apartments. We looked at some data from the census. We got data from the developer and triangulated that essentially and developed our own projections of how many kids we think will live in the building. We project 8 grade school kids and 4 high school kids. Again, these are projections. Could be lower, could be higher, but we think this is a reasonable assumption, or both of these are reasonable assumptions in terms of the number of school-age children living in the building. In order, as I said, it's a function of the number of kids and how much, and then it's also a function of what tuition is for the school districts at the time that they're there. So we used the most recent school district tuition amounts, per capita tuition, PCT, for the 2 districts. So your grade school district, it's about $17,000 this year. High school district's almost $22,000 per enrolled student. And so we multiply those obviously by the kids. So 8 times 16, 9, and 4 times 21, 7. We also then had to do an escalation assumption, just as we do with taxes in general. We had to look at how fast taxes are growing for the school districts. They're growing faster than the village, I guess, and you probably know this because you live here. The last 5 years, the grade school district's been growing at about 3.2% a year, and the high school district's been growing at almost 5% a year. So in our model, those numbers grow annually faster than the taxes grow, if that makes sense. The 21's growing at 5% a year for 20 years. The 17,000 is growing at 3% a year. So we basically modeled in, if those numbers of kids are the number every year, 8 and 4 every year, and the tuition payments grow every year at those percentages, we took that out of the model. That was off the top for school kids. So we think it's reasonable. Obviously, these are all numbers that could change. If the school boards spend less, then those would grow less. If they spend more, those would grow more. We can't know that. You can't know that. They can't know that today. But we think there's a reasonable assumptions based on prior behavior and prior performance of similar apartment buildings. So this is that $33 million number. That's in the blue there. That's based on our assumptions, which we think are well evidenced, how much money would be left to pay debt service on bonds. For the sake of clarity, we also did the math if, for some reason, a tidal wave of kids came into this building. In this case, almost 20 grade school kids and 5 to 7 high school kids, and you hit the maximum, basically hit the statutory maximum. How much money would there be available? It is materially less. It's $25 million. So $8 million more in payments are possible to the schools if you hit the tuition max. We don't think that's likely, but again, nobody knows for sure. And the output of all this is this column of numbers, which is we've provided to Anthony and Spear Financial, and they've used this projection, this annual cash flow basically from now to the end of the life of the TIF to figure out how much debt is supportable in a way that is consistent with state law. As Matt mentioned, you've got to have 1.25 times coverage in every year in order to be able to issue these bonds, special revenue bonds with a general obligation backstop. And so this is the I think a key input to Anthony's analysis that says that $16 million is supportable, I guess, today based on these projections and his estimates of the markets. I don't want to overstate his conclusions. He can do that for himself, but that's, I believe, the short answer as to where we are at this point with our projections and Anthony's analysis. Happy to answer questions.
Okay. Thank you. On that table, the 2025 and 2026, obviously it shows, zero increment. Is that based on the delay, because in DuPage County, the taxes are a year behind, and that's why the 2 years are zero?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Right, so I think our estimate, I don't have the model up in front of me, but if we start construction, and the developers provided their timeline, I think it's 18 months from construction start to C of O or occupancy, and then there's some time to lease up. So I think we've assumed that there's not much incremental value in that, even that second year of construction, and then, as you say, Mayor, there's a lag of a year. So again, if it goes faster, if they lease up sooner, if the assessor finds value sooner, that second zero in particular could have some number, probably not going to be a huge one. So, and the way that bonds are structured, I believe, and again, Anthony can correct me, there's capitalized interest, and so there's funds available to make that payment in those first 2 years, and maybe even the third. And then, once you get to year 4, you can see the numbers kind of grow at inflation, basically, 1.28, 1.30, that's essentially the 2.3% growth going forward, so that you essentially reach stabilization, and that's, but yes, short answer to your question is yes, Mayor. I guess I gave you a very long answer, and I put to agree with you.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions from the board? Trustee Alfano?
Thank you. When schools report the number of kids that they have, is that at the beginning of the year? Is that as students move in? Because the nature of apartment living is you get that month-to-month kind of change.
Yeah, the TIF Act has rules. I apologize. I'm going to do the dates. I'm not going to get them exactly right, but I think they're required to, the school districts are required to send a letter to the village by the end of either September or October. I can't remember which, based on their census of the new year, I think, effectively. And then the village has to make a payment, and I think it's either into that, 2 or 3 months, maybe it's into January, February, but it's basically pretty quickly. There's got to be documentation. The village has to get comfortable with it. If, I don't know what the standard that we're going to require of them is, or you're going to require of them is. But I guess to get to your answer, it's the kids who are enrolled basically for the fall.
Okay.
So if they do move in February, they wouldn't, they would be in the next fall, but they wouldn't, there wouldn't be a payment required. The state laws makes it simple, sort of, from an administrative point of view. There's just one date that matters.
Okay, anyone else on the board? Questions? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Joe. And then the Anthony Maselli is with Spear Financial. And there's a, in the packet, I believe we sent out their analysis as well.
Is there anything on here, Matt, or should I leave the computer?
No, there's nothing on there.
Oh, okay. Good evening. So you should have a packet that kind of looks like that I'll speak to. Wasn't sure if it was going to be up there or not. But a couple of things that I'll point to just to piggyback off of Jeff's comments. So the key input that I'm going to get from SB Friedman is the projected revenues. Per state statute, you are allowed to issue general obligation alternate revenue source bonds as long as you can prove that you have 1 1/4 coverage on the projected revenues. So SB Friedman's part is to provide those projected revenues, and then we are able to go out and issue the general obligation alternate revenue source bonds. This page shows you an estimate using previously provided estimates by Jeff, which we will tie out on prior to the actual issuance of the TIF revenues. We then are able to issue those general obligation bonds with a term not to exceed 20 years. So that's one thing to point out. The TIF goes out beyond that. The GO bonds cannot go beyond 20 years for non-home rule GO alt-rev bonds backed by TIF. So you're going to have a period at the end where you're going to recover additional increment that's not used to pay the debt service on the bonds. The other thing is, as you'll see in the right side, the sources and uses of funds of these bonds, we're estimating a project deposit of $13 million. That's the financial gap. That's the amount we're depositing into the project fund. You'll see that there's another large deposit called the deposit to the capitalized interest fund. So this is in relation to the fact that there are 2 zeros up there for estimated revenue in 25 and 26. If we issue the bonds in 2024, we are going to have interest to pay in 25 and 26. In order to pay that interest without the availability of incremental revenue, we will bond for that revenue. We're allowed to bond for that revenue and put it in the fund, in the debt service fund, to pay the interest in those 2 years. So if you're looking at this page and you see the columns, kind of in the middle of the page, the principal, interest, and capitalized interest columns, you'll see that in the first 2 years, we do not have any principal payments on the bond issue. We do have interest that accrues, and then we have in the fund, in order to pay that interest, capitalized interest that will make that payment. In year 3, which is 2027, we're expected to have increment available, and we then will have interest that would be paid against that increment when we will conceivably not have capitalized interest. If the final projections, based on timing, show that we don't have enough increment in that year, we can capitalize all or a portion of the interest in that third year if we needed to.
These are sent out in the weekly report, and I did not get them into the committee of the whole, but I see if we can get them up here in a minute.
It's the last attachment from your
Yeah.
email.
Yes, and we'll, yeah. Could you, I'm sorry, thank you, Suzanne, I'm sorry. We'll get it up in just a minute, so.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
If you are, those of you that have in front of you are looking through it, I'll mention that. So the other thing is, again, we're amortizing these bonds over a period not to exceed 20 years. When we are amortizing that principal repayment, what you'll notice is we have debt service. Once the increment starts to come in, we have debt service that mirrors the increase in the increment. So as increment is expected to grow, debt service will slowly grow with it. And you'll see the estimated coverage column. So as of these numbers, based on current rates, we're looking at coverage right around 1.33 times. So we'll have $1.33 in revenues for every dollar of debt service, as projected. Couple things to point out. We don't know where interest rates will be when we go to sell the bonds. We have some cushion here that we have enough. Again, we can't sell the bonds unless we prove the 1 1/4 coverage as a minimum. So if we did run into that situation, the variable there is how much we can bond for, which means it may not be a $13 million project fund deposit in that situation if rates increase to a level where we don't have the 1 1/4 coverage. So I guess from the village's standpoint, know that we can only bond for the amount that all of these projections and current interest rates allow. We will not bond for an additional amount that isn't supported by the revenue stream. I think in terms of the rates on the bonds, I think it's a fair representation of where rates are today. Again, we can go additional, we can capitalize additional interest if we needed to, depending on where the final projections come out from SB Friedman. So in anticipation of having the model up, if there's any questions I can answer now, I'd be happy to.
Does anyone have questions?
I do, at the risk of sounding whatever. So when we do this, when we have this deposit of capitalized interest fund, there's no way of making that back. And I see that it kind of comes off at the very bottom here because it's the 13 and 8 of the interest and then the capitalized interest. That's just kind of, I don't want to call it a loss, but it's essentially a loss, right?
You're borrowing to make a payment. I mean, if you think about that, I mean, you have $1.2 million in interest to pay over 2 years without revenue to pay it. So you're borrowing against it. You're effectively increasing the size of the loan to accommodate that.
Got it.
So you're paying interest on your interest, but it's kind of a necessary step when you don't have the revenue stream to support it.
And this isn't unique to this project, right? I mean, right, because there's always going to be construction costs, there's going to be money in, but no money, or money out, no money in. Okay.
Yeah, it is not to that point, no. I mean, especially in these TIF projects where if the money needs to come in at the early end of the project, we are not going to get revenues. And frankly, unless the village were going to put that money in, we would need to have some sort of deposit into the bond fund, or else we don't show the coverage we need for state statute.
Got it. Okay.
Okay.
Just a question. Where, and I think you mentioned it, where if interest rates go sky high, there's really no way to estimate what that revenues would be. Do we have that, I don't want to say kind of built in, but is there like a buffer zone there where if it does go, really high, like how do we kind of ensure that we're able to kind of hit that 1.25 or whatever it would be?
Yeah, so
Sorry.
a rock star now.
Oh, mic drop at the end.
Yeah. So the lever you pull actually is on the deposit to the project. So this shows a $13 million deposit to the project fund. If we see ourselves in November, December, whenever we end up issuing these bonds, and rates are so dramatically higher that we're not making our coverage, what we do is we have to lower that project amount. We can't get the full 13 million. Right? Because we can't adjust the revenues. Those are independent of this. We have to, thank you.
Thank you.
We have to, here, let's see if I can do this. There we go. I don't know if that's any more helpful because of how small it is. You ran for nothing, I'm sorry. So, the column on the left there, the revenues are what they are. We can only bond for, and the interest rates are what they are to a degree, right? That's market driven. So the only thing we can do is issue less and not get the full project deposit. So I'm sure, the developer's hoping that doesn't happen, the village is hoping that doesn't happen. But if we got down to that, that would be a conversation at the time as to, hey, we can get you 12.5 million, not 13, because this is what it is.
Right. Any early indication on a trend of where interest rates are going?
Yeah, I'll tell you that pre-Fed action in September, the indication was that, we were going to get, Fed was going to cut rates. In general, that was taken as a good sign. We were going to see rates starting to come down, or continuing to come down, because interest rates have come down this year, quite a bit. That did not happen. Actually, long-term rates kind of came up a bit. Treasury rates specifically are up 30 basis points plus since September. Municipal rates are only up about 10. So we're still hanging in pretty good, and I think the estimates here, so each one of these, you see each one of these principal payment dates, that's actually a separate set of bonds. So they all have their own rates. But the average rate, the all-in rate, when you even take in all the costs to issue these bonds, when I ran this was about a 3.82%. That was all in. I still think that's reasonable despite the backup, because I always add a little cushion in there when I do estimate these things. Where we are post-election and with all of that, I think there's a lot of volatility that could happen, so it's hard to say. I hope that there's enough cushion in here that we don't change that much. I think it would take quite a bit to get down to the 1.25, though, given that we're at least comfortably in the 133 right now in terms of coverage. So, cool. It's kind of a dance around your direct question of my crystal ball, but it is as cloudy as the rest of ours.
So you don't have,
Trustee,
so you don't have like an estimate of what rate it would have to be for you to fall off?
Oh, I can do that, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do I have it now? No.
No,
Yeah,
but
I could
yeah,
do a
you can-
sensitivity. Yeah,
Yeah, can you do a sensitivity, please?
100%.
okay. Any other questions?
I did want to point out one thing. So as we go through this, there is the formula based here, and the research that Jeff did was based on what are the projected rates, and those are defensible projected rates of the number of kids that could come into the district. However, if more came and we didn't have a IGA with the districts, we would still run the risk. If in the spreadsheet that I sent out on Friday, and apologize, we didn't put everything in the committee of the whole packet, but if we are at the statutory max, this, even with the 1.33% coverage here, we still don't cover all the potential students that would come. So what I'm working on with both school districts, and we've made presentations to the finance committees on D45 and D88, which are the school districts served by this, that would serve this population in this building, and that's all this covers. There is a substantially larger TIF district, but we're only talking about this building, this project. So we're looking at trying to come up with an estimate around 8 kids for D45 and around 4 kids for D88, a percentage of the total increment that would average out to that number of kids. So that's the intergovernmental agreement that we're presenting to them. The other part of that is that using up to 80% of total increment towards either payment of the payment to the districts, payment to the library, payment of the bond, or payment to lower the to set aside for early payment off of the bond if we gather enough money there. So that's something else we'd like to do. I think something that if we can pay the bond off sooner, I mean, if you look in those out years, those last 2045, 2046, 2047, that increment goes into the TIF fund for other projects. Now, I don't know how many of you will be on the board in 2045, but there will be people here and there will be projects to do in the area. We can pay the bond off as early as December of 2037 if the number of kids that actually show up in the district, or if we have an IGA that limits those payments to the average expected that move into the district from outside the district. So then that would allow us to pay that bond off early, and there'd be more money for everybody. Because once the bond is paid off, then we would be, the TIF, the payments to the school districts would be whatever number of kids they have there, which our estimate is no more than we're talking about up here. But if if there were additional kids, if we have the bond paid off, they get the full number, whatever that is. So that's our goal, is to, if we get ahead on the amount of money, that final column on the right up there, that estimated remaining incremental revenues after debt service, if we put some of that towards towards a fund to pay off the loan early, we look to try and get it paid down sooner and have more money to use in other projects in the TIF. And also, there'd be more money for...
Yeah, and just to clarify, Matt,
Yep.
the bonds, currently estimating bonds to be callable in 34. So that's a provision we set.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
rather than
34.
37.
Yeah,
So that's
34.
a provision that we set when we issue the bonds.
Yeah.
It's typically 10 years.
Yeah. Right. December of 2034.
Yeah.
When do you anticipate selling these bonds?
Yeah, that's, so, subject to the RDA, I think right now we're looking at a bond ordinance in November, but again, that's subject to everything else being approved on the village's end. But we're in a position where we have the official statement ready to go, we're ready to go to rating agencies. We're gonna move quickly on our end to make it happen, subject to rates and the RDA.
Any other questions from the board? Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, anything else you want to close with?
I don't know if
Public
there's any
comments on
public
that?
comment, but I think that this is I think one of the things that you can feel fairly confident about is that this project, since we're looking at 33% coverage and state law requires 25% coverage, that we've got an excellent chance that this project does everything that we hope it's going to do. And one of the, what we're talking about is a 200, and actually it's now 238 unit, mixed use development on Villa Avenue in the area we're trying to make into one of the most vibrant parts of our village. This will be across the street from the recreation center. It'll bring in 7,500 square feet to 8,000 square feet of commercial, likely a restaurant, maybe a couple other office buildings. On the ground floor, 94 or 90-plus public parking spaces covered right in the center of this district. I mean, I think these things are definite positives. We have seen success in the TIF, usage of TIF just down the street, just across the street, basically, at Ovaltine. Ovaltine is managed by the same company that we're talking about this deal with. They are invested in the area. We have representatives here, if you have any questions, from the Three Leaf Partners, who's working with Marquette on this project. It's an extremely positive advance for the village, and if you have any questions about it, we are more than happy to continue talking about the project.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely, I think this is a great project in Villa Park. Be a great addition to that area. Okay, we will move on to item 4 is public comments. Clerk Nicky, anyone signed up for public comments?
No.
We have anyone in the public who would like to make a comment?
I don't know if I want to make a comment. I just want a clarification, more of the fact that you talked about how many students are in the building makes a difference on this TIF and the money put out. But do we have any guarantee if, God forbid, that their building ends up not being able to go up and be filled the way they're anticipating, or the store's not happening, to protect us on this TIF case and the money that... We have a lot of people that are still remembering North Avenue. So I'm curious on, I would love, everybody expects this to do what it's supposed to do, but if it doesn't, how's the village going to be protected if it doesn't go through the way it's supposed to?
Well, so I can answer this, and I can, if you want some analysis from our partners, I could ask them. But first of all, right now, TIF 3 is bringing in about $2 million a year. So it was very slow developing, but it's healthy now. Unfortunately, it's, later there was no one big project. The one big project on North Avenue was our first TIF, which is the target TIF, and that was successful. But the later
One was not.
North one, it's not as successful, certainly. It was slow to develop, definitely. So, there is absolutely no guarantee that anything will happen, but I think the level of preparation and the point at which the partners, and I see David standing up in the back, but this project is ready to go.
They're talking about the fear also. We're talking about this project, so it's ready to go. It's totally different than what's going at the train station.
Absolutely.
You know,
A variety of
It's a totally different
ways,
thing,
yes.
and I
Yeah.
think we've got some residents that are a little leery on you going out for bonds on this. And,
Yeah.
I mean, this one's set up, we understand, set up as residents a lot better than that one was.
Yeah.
But I think they're still kind of leery, you're putting out bond money out for a TIF thing, how we're going to not be stuck on the hook.
Sure.
These numbers look great, as long as it goes that way, but I think a lot of people want to know that we have some type of safety net or something set in if you go that far.
I don't know, Dave, if you want to come up, just kind of give your name, please.
David Lyon, I represent the developer. So let me answer the question in a different way. The project on North Avenue, bonds were issued before there was evidence of all the capital being available. That's my understanding. What we've committed to, and which will be memorialized in the redevelopment agreement, or RDA, is that we're going to evidence our debt and equity, all of our capital, prior to the bonds even being issued. So we've been in conversations about that since the very beginning, including with corporate counsel. So we expect that to be memorialized in the RDA, and we don't expect the village to issue bonds until we've got our capital in escrow and available for the project. So I think that's a key difference between our project and the other, and mitigates the risk that was just articulated.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, anyone else? Public comments?
Just a couple other things. One thing we've said multiple times, we own the land here, and it makes the transfer different. We also, like you're pointing out, the having all the equity in escrow before we issue the debt is different than on North Avenue. It's also different than in a more recent TIF over on what was originally Garden Station. Those deals are handled differently. And one of the reasons that, when we went through this project to begin with, we were not anticipating having to issue bonds, but things have changed in the market, and to get the investment from the private sector, this has become necessary. It's not it's not ideal, but it has become necessary. So there is risk, but unless there are severe changes in the financial situation between now and the end of the year, we should be good. And if it happens before we sell bonds, then we're going to have to stop and evaluate, and before we go that risk. Same thing with Catalyst and or Three Leaf and Marquette. So they're looking for us to make some steps, some concrete steps towards making sure that we don't disappear from this deal, and I think this is one of the ones that we're talking about tonight. I think that the proof that the village is dedicated to trying to make this happen. When we did the Ovaltine TIF a number of years ago, the question was whether or not to go to the west side of Villa Avenue. We decided not to at that time, and although we did have there are some projects that have gone well, we didn't say anything of this scale. So we feel pretty confident that this is, but thank you for your questions.
Okay. Motion to adjourn. We have a motion. Trustee Cordova, do we have a second? Trustee Kumar? Okay, all in favor? Aye. Okay, we will close out the committee of the whole meeting, and we will adjourn our regular meeting at 7 o'clock. Thank you.